Hey, howdy, political orphans, swing voters, independents, double haters, all of you out there who are trying to figure out what the hell sense to make of this election now as we get perilously close. And we've been doing sort of a series of countdowns with different experts around the country. And this time I thought it would be interesting if we sort of reached out and picked somebody more the west coast of the country. We spent an awful lot of time talking about Georgia and Pennsylvania and Wisconsin and Michigan and places like that. But there are big questions about Arizona and Nevada. And then there are also questions about states that used to be swing states, as we've heard, but no longer are swing states. So if you look at places like Iowa and Ohio, and I think, honestly, Florida, they're really not battlegrounds. And, in 2000, we all watched Florida and its hanging chads force us into recalls and Supreme Court races. Ohio used to be a suspense with Republican and presidential candidates facing off. It's really not anymore. Iowa's gone so hard evangelical. It's not a question. So the universe keeps shrinking. And that's actually part of the story, I think, about political realignment. And we see it from sort of a big picture because we've talked about it on the podcast, right? The fact that George H. Bush could no longer win Maine and Republicans have largely vanished in New England, except for Phil Scott, the very popular governor of Maine, of Vermont, who's been reelected 4 times. My kind of guy. He drives to work in a pickup truck and takes with him his dog with him every day to the governor's office, which explains why he gets reelected. And then you look at the South, and Bill Clinton's Blue Dog Coalition is a vanishing memory. So we're going to spend some time with Seth Masket, who's at the University of Denver, writes a great weekly blog. In fact, he just did a very thoughtful piece this week on realignment. And so, Seth, glad to have you. We've used you in some of our episodes, but we thought it'd be worthwhile to have an extended conversation with you this time around.
Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm looking forward to it.
So let's talk about realignment. What are you sort of watching? Because you were focusing more on what I'd almost describe micro trends, not the fact that corners of geography in the country flip, but the fact that subgroups are shifting around. Let's talk about that from 20,000 feet and what you've got your eye on in November.
Yeah, I mean, just looking sort of historically at the concept of realignments, one thing we know is that like sudden big shifts in the electorate are actually really rare. Like you can point to like 1860, 1896, 1932 as these like big pivotal elections where suddenly like there were big issue shifts by the parties, there were big swings of one demographic group or another. Those are very rare. Usually what you see is just more subtle shifting from election to election. The really interesting trends that are going on right now and that are getting a fair amount of attention is that you see, on one hand, you have like a handful of very conservative Republicans publicly endorsing Kamala Harris. People like Liz Cheney, former Vice President Dick Cheney. Which is not necessarily meaning that there's like a big shift by conservatives to back Harris, but there's a few, at least on the margins. And then you also have these trends where we see Latino men, black men, who historically very democratic populations, drifting somewhat in Trump's direction. And, we'll see. I think this has been a little overhyped as a storyline, but there may be something going on there. And if you actually see substantial numbers of black voters supporting the Republican, that's a big historic shift, even if Trump comes nowhere near winning that demographic. So, those have been like the big trends that I think people are focused on right now.
Well, let me tell you one other one that I think is interesting to watch are young men under 30 who seem to be breaking really hard towards Trump and Republicans. The problem with those folks is they don't vote for the most part. They're really hard to motivate. They're really hard to get to polls, in contrast to women under 30, which has now become, I think, probably the second strongest Democratic base after black women. Do you agree?
That may be the case, yeah, particularly in a post-Dobbs decision world. We've seen and that's an area where like, young women in particular are very motivated to turn out by that decision. But you're right that like younger voters in general tend to be much lower turnout. One area where we're seeing some shifting, it's young voters, particularly young voters without a college education. That has become, and particularly white young voters without a college education, that has become a very strong Republican coalition But you're correct that they are a pretty low turnout group, and they tend to be somewhat harder to poll. They tend to not answer survey questions as much, and it's a little unclear just what kind of numbers they're going to turn out in, and it's a harder group to track.
So let's talk about the shift in the Trump coalition, and this we're going to play political scientists more so than election observers. We'll get more into grainy stuff. But what happens when Trump's gone after this election or after 4 years? Does it blow up and go back to traditional Republican and Democratic coalitions, or are the two parties fundamentally changed because of the coalition he's built?
That is a really tough question to answer, and honestly, one that we won't know for a few years. But
oh, come on, guess at it.
Yeah.
We're not going to hold you to it.
Oh, yeah, I know. What? I'm going to be wrong for like the 80,000th time? Okay, fine. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting to think about, first of all, like what the Republican Party itself looks like once Donald Trump is out of the picture. I mean, I don't think, even if they want to, I don't think they know how to topple him as a force while he's alive. But, at some point he will not be. Or at some point he may just lose interest in politics, which I kind of doubt, but okay. It's interesting to think about. We got some sense of that watching some of the Republican presidential debates last year that he did not participate in. When you had like Nikki Haley and Ron DeSantis and Vivek Ramaswamy and other candidates in the mix, sometimes talking about things that were not Donald Trump. They were talking about immigration. They were talking about China policy, taxation, the welfare state. And I think you get a little sense of that once Trump is not in the picture, it doesn't exactly snap back to the old Reagan-Bush coalition, but it's also not exactly still Trump's party. That is, you do have some sort of people like Nikki Haley who have sort of like a more traditional view of conservatism and conservative economics, and like what the Republicans used to advocate is like the American place in the world and foreign policy. I don't think that automatically dominates, but it isn't an automatic loser like it is today. I think you actually see the party fighting it out in primary elections as to what U.S. foreign policy should look like and what the taxation burden should look like, and something where it's like the populist coalition that Trump has really put in charge has to fight for it, and they're not an automatic winner all the time. And I think we'd see that play out in elections to some extent. My impression is that a lot of, particularly young men moving toward the Republican Party, a lot of that is very dependent on Trump. That that's him very effectively leveraging his celebrity, and that the party loses some of that when they lose him. But on the other hand, when we do see demographic shifting, when we do see something like a realignment, those tend to be kind of permanent going forward. And we've seen the black voters in the United States have been like a very strongly Democratic coalition over the last 50 odd years. There's nothing magical keeping that in place, right? There's no reason that has to remain the same going forward. A lot of that has been really kept in place by social and community pressure. There's a wonderful book by Shrill Laird and Ismail White about this very, very concept. But that doesn't mean it's written in stone going forward. So we might see a slow drifting of that coalition, maybe a little bit more toward the Republicans over time. But I think that really has been fueled by Trump. And if there is any movement there, it's slowed down a lot with him out of the picture.
But I think it's driven to some degree from my personally feeling on it. It's cultural more than anything else, right? As the Republican Party has become more cultural politically, it clearly is what I think is driving Hispanic voters towards Republicans, right? They tend to be Catholic or evangelicals. They have large families. A lot of the woke stuff doesn't play well. They got beat up during the COVID shutdown because it's a lot of blue collar workers. So I think that's a movement that's going to persist. And similarly, I think there's been black conservatives forever. They just have tended to vote Democratic, you said, because of social pressures locally. But as the black community becomes more diffuse nationally, and we're not just talking about black voters in South Carolina that helped Biden win in 20, it's going to be black voters who are suburban rappers, everything else in the world, than like the whites in the country and the Hispanics in the country, I think they'll fragment much more going forward.
I mean, that's certainly plausible. I mean, as you note, there have been pretty conservative elements in both the Black and Latino communities for a long time. Some of that is about economics. Some of that is about cultural issues. Some of that about abortion, about same-sex marriage. That has still not necessarily translated into many of these folks voting Republican. A lot of them have voted Democratic, despite disagreeing with the party on a number of cultural issues. But sometimes it'll move around. So Latinos voted in, not majority, but in stronger numbers for George W. Bush in 2004. I think in part because of his stances on immigration reform. And if there's some movement toward Trump now, I'm not totally sure what's motivating it. I mean, some of that is about, interestingly, about immigration. Some of it is about cultural issues. But it's not obvious when those issues are going to get activated and when they're not.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. If you ask me strategically, if I got to pick the vice president candidates based on who I thought would help the ticket most, I clearly would have picked Josh Shapiro if I was a Democrat, just because the entire election may rise and fall on Pennsylvania. And on the Republican side, I would have picked Mark Rubio. I mean, if you've got a trend moving to Hispanic way, why not have a Spanish speaker as a vice president to signal we're open to the Hispanic population coming in and everything else in the world? Now, I actually heard a story, apocryphal or not, that some of the folks around Trump said, oh my God, if you pick Rubio, that means for sure the establishment will impeach Trump as soon as he gets into office, and the Republicans and the Democrats will throw him out, and Rubio's going to be the president, which, there's a lot of crazy town stuff going on in sort of the Trump circles at times. And I thought that was one of them. But again, I think strategically, I think they both made an error. I don't think Walz has played well. He's really not playing well in the Midwest, which is why they picked him in the first place. The idea you would win Wisconsin by having a Vikings fan as the vice presidential candidate is an absolute horrible decision. Although you could be Hillary Clinton, right, to be a Cubs fan today, but a Yankees fan tomorrow. So we'll see. Anyway, we'll be back with Seth Masket in just a minute. Hang with us. It's Lost in the Middle, America's Political Orphans.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. Our country recognizes homeownership as one of the best ways to build wealth and stable communities. But over the years, support for homeownership has dwindled, and our leaders have lost sight of its value. We're working to change that. The American Property Owners Alliance is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that holds our leaders accountable to safeguard homeowners and communities. Visit propertyownersalliance.org to learn more and find out how you can join our efforts.
Hey, welcome back, my fellow political orphans. A great discussion here as we move to episode number 4 of our countdown just before the election. And we're joined by Seth Masket at the University of Denver. He's also a scholar at the Kluge Center at the Library of Congress. It's Kluge. It was an ancestor of mine who forgot to drop the E along the way, but he was the founder of one of the largest media companies in the world and has put a substantial amount of money into preserving the Library of Congress and sponsoring great political scientists like Seth. So, Seth, let's talk about it's election night. The bowl of cheese popcorn's next to you on your couch, and it'll be a late night, so you're drinking Mountain Dew to stay awake like your students would do finishing term papers. And tell me a couple of places you're watching on election night. I mean,
I'm watching a lot of the swing states like everyone else is, but I know that, those numbers are going to be slow coming in. Particularly like Pennsylvania is a really important state, and it might literally decide the whole election. We won't necessarily know everything overnight. One of the things I've been really kind of focusing on, so I live in Colorado, I live in Denver. there are the city of Aurora is right next to Denver, and Trump chose to make Aurora as kind of he chose to basically nationalize that city and make it he brought a lot of attention to it recently by going there, giving a speech, even though Colorado's really not a swing state. And Trump was trying to raise the threat of gangs of undocumented immigrants taking over the town of Aurora. This, of course, is wildly inflated and essentially fabricated information, but he tried to make an example of it. And I'm interested in the way it votes. So Aurora is actually a really interesting city in that it actually straddles 3 different counties: Arapahoe County, Adams County, and Douglas County in Colorado, with pretty substantial Latino representation there. So Arapahoe has, I think, 20% Latino. Adams County is like 40% Latino. Douglas County less so, but Arapahoe and Adams County lean toward Biden pretty strongly. Douglas County is a lot more competitive. Basically, I'm interested to know, like, what does Trump singling out a community like that do to the vote, if anything, right? Does it stimulate Latinos to turn out and vote as a way of saying, you're misdescribing us, this is not accurate, and we want to stand up for ourselves? Do we see like a higher than usual Latino vote? Do we see whites turn out in higher numbers? Do we see Douglas County that voted marginally for Trump? Does it move more in that direction or less in that direction? I'm actually curious what kind of effect it has when he singles out an area and tries to make an example of it.
Why did Colorado turn so blue so fast? And what was the tipping point?
You know, it's interesting. We saw a number of states, including Colorado, made some interesting shifts basically between the 2012 and 2016 elections. And a lot of it had to do, you know, you can predict some of this by basically how much college education the white population of the state has. So like Ohio and, a couple of other states in the upper Midwest, like shifted more to the right. And we saw that in Florida as well. You know, these are states where, you know, you have whites without a whole lot of college education there. Those shifted more Republican. And then you had Colorado, where you have a pretty high percentage of whites with a college education shift more to the left. And so that's an area where, like, you saw swing states move quickly into one of the two camps based on, you know, the percentage of whites with a college education. In places like Colorado, where you have like a highly educated white population, that's a group that tended really not to take to Trump, really not to like him. And it was kind of fascinating because Colorado, like Florida, like Ohio, had been a swing state in 2012. And it had been a swing state for a while. And suddenly it's just not remotely competitive. And in 2016, you started to see Democrats winning by pretty substantial margins. By 2018, Jared Polis was winning by very large margins.
Jared being the Democratic governor of Colorado.
The Democratic nominee in Colorado. By 2022, Jared Polis won re-election by more than Democrats win in California. Like it just became a very uncompetitive state very quickly.
Well, and that's the number I always throw around a lot, that Gavin Newsom won California with 59% of the vote, which is pretty jaw-dropping until you figure out that Mike DeWine won Ohio by 66%. So yeah. Ohio's more Republican than California's Democrat, which is sort of hard to wrap your arms around. But Colorado also had, even on the presidential years, you used to have a pretty split congressional delegation. And if I'm right now, you only have one Republican and you've got sort of one well-known Republican for not all the right reasons.
No, more than one Republican. Oh. So you have the third congressional district. So some of these things are a little in flux right now because you've got Lauren Boebert in the process of switching districts.
Bingo.
But the third district and the fourth and the fifth are still represented by Republicans. So, three of the 8 districts. And that's likely to be the case after the election, too. She's likely to win her new district in the fourth. The Republican will probably win in the third, but we'll see. That's actually a pretty close battleground.
Okay, so for people who don't sleep at night with an American almanac of politics by their side, what are those districts? Is that the eastern part of the state that's still largely ranch land and agricultural?
Yeah, so the fourth district is essentially like the eastern third of the state of Colorado. It's a lot of ranch land. It's a heavy farming community. Includes a bit of Fort Collins. The third district, which was Lauren Boebert's old district, is mostly the Mountain West. Okay, so it's like the western half of the state, and that includes it actually includes Pueblo. It includes Durango. It includes, but it's mostly a lot of like ranching areas of the state and a lot of the mountain resort communities. So those are both Republican leaning, but very different profiles. The western part is a lot more competitive, and it's honestly a different set of issues motivating the voters.
Okay, when we come back, I want to spend some more time talking about other battleground states around the country. I appreciate the lesson here in Colorado, but I think I'd like to get your sense on some of the traditional battleground states. And what I really want to know is, again, you got the TV on and Steve Kornacki's getting wired because it's getting close and he's bending over, hunching over the blackboard and scribbling numbers. I want to know what states you're going to watch or areas, particularly in those battleground states. And then I also want to talk about independents, because independents, for example, are the largest registration group now in Nevada and Arizona. They're close in Pennsylvania. They call them unaffiliated in New Hampshire because they want to sort of be snooty and make them different than the rest of the country. But your thoughts on whether the independent trend builds after this election or whether it really evaporates? And I know traditionally, political scientists are skeptics about independence and skeptics about ticket splitting, but there's some really interesting stuff going on in U.S. Senate races and House races that I think a lot of people aren't paying attention to. So we'll be back in just a little while to pick up those threads of my random thoughts. Here's the team behind Lost in the Middle. Executive producer Jeff Mayers. Producer Todd Elbaugh. Edited by Aaron Zummers. Production at Civic Media. And a quick thanks to our partners at the American Property Owners Alliance. Yeah, well, I'm not going to play FM DJ, but I've had a number of fans of the show ask me what this band is. And it's actually a great band out of Chicago called Liquid Soul, which is a conglomeration of all-stars from a lot of jazz and funk bands around Chicago. So if you like that kind of music, Liquid Soul, I'm sure you can find it. So back to my Steve Kornacki thing. What I find really fascinating about this election is in 2022, there was an explosion of ticket splitting across the country. And most of your colleagues in the political science world will say, well, this is sort of a little quaint thing that used to happen in American politics, and it doesn't happen anymore. But it did. I mean, it happened in Wisconsin. As people listening to the show know, I grew up in a family with an Irish Catholic Democratic mother and a German Lutheran Republican. So we didn't talk much about theological issues at my kitchen table and rarely about politics. But my mom loved Ronald Reagan, and my dad used to support a longtime Wisconsin Democrat named Bill Proxmire. So if you look right now in the U.S. Senate, there's only one member, Susan Collins, who won her state, while a presidential candidate of the other party, Joe Biden, won her state. Other than that, it's lockstep. It's all 49 either get carried by the president or they lose. Now, this time out, there's a number of battleground states across the country in the Senate that I think are interesting to watch. Right here, it's Tammy Baldwin, who originally took my House seat when I quit sticking to my term limit pledge. But if you look, Ohio, Sherrod Brown is hanging on by his fingernails. Casey's in trouble in Pennsylvania. Do you think we'll see a surge in ticket splitting where actually Trump might carry Ohio, but Sherrod Brown hangs on, or Tammy Baldwin hangs on in Wisconsin and Wisconsin goes to Trump?
Yeah, I mean, you're right that I don't know how much we poo-poo split ticket voting, but it is, one thing that we found is it's just increasingly rare. It used to be a lot more common, particularly when you had a fair number of Democratic members of Congress from the South, from a pretty conservative region. That was often voting Republican in presidential elections, but still sticking with their Democratic incumbents. And we just don't have that as much anymore. But once in a while, you do. And particularly with incumbents like Sherrod Brown in Ohio, like you mentioned, like John Tester in Montana. Those are Democrats who are only there in the Senate now because people are occasionally open to splitting their ticket. These are both states that have voted pretty strongly in the Republican direction in recent years, and yet these Democrats have managed to eke out victories, just by, sort of communicating a personal brand that's different from their party, by, exploiting some divisions among the Republicans. I think at least in Ohio, at least in Montana, maybe to some extent in Wisconsin, we're still going to see some significant ticket splitting there on these races. I don't know, the polling doesn't look great for Tester right now, but he's definitely going to do better than Kamala Harris is in Montana, probably by at least 10 points. Sherrod Brown is definitely going to do better than Kamala Harris did in Ohio, whether he wins or not. And there's I think a decent chance that Brown ekes this one out as he has in the past. But it's close. It's a pretty narrow contest. But again, and these moments are rare, but they do exist. One of the things I think it's interesting to see Kamala Harris's election strategy. You see her trying to do something that honestly was pretty similar to an approach that Hillary Clinton tried in 2016, which is to essentially try and peel off some Republicans who are specifically bothered by Donald Trump. And that's part of like using the Liz Cheney endorsement, part by, trying to campaign among Republicans and saying, hey, regardless of how you feel about your party, clearly you have some problems with Trump, right? So please consider voting for me on the Democratic, the presidential ballot, but then do what you want further down the ballot. I don't think she's not saying that specifically out loud, but that seems to be kind of the style of this, trying to take advantage of voters who are very happy to vote Republican down the ballot, but have some issues with Trump. I don't know that it was wrong for Hillary Clinton to pursue that in 2016. That might have been a very smart strategy, or the best strategy available to her, even if it didn't mean an electoral college win. And it might work for Harris. But it is, at least a nod to the idea that there is some split ticket voting that occurs.
Now, here's another one again, and this is for some of my political junkies who are listening to this, that there's actually the same thing going on with Republican House seats around the country, which people haven't paid attention to, where they're actually outperforming Trump in the House seats. And so in the Senate, just again, for those of you who aren't completely consumed by this is, Seth and I are like rotisserie baseball fans. We're in the, who's the best hitting third stop combined with the best fielding percentage. It's trying to figure this out. But here's the weird part is that the balance of the House could likely come down to New York and California. And when you think about that, it's the two states you wouldn't think Republicans are trying to hold on for the majority. But in the 2022 election, you got a lot of Republicans elected in places that they normally wouldn't get elected. So now you've got this cluster in New York and you've got this cluster in California. And so I think most people will tell you the Republicans are going to take the Senate. West Virginia's done. Tester's down now by 8 or 9 points. That's well outside the margin of error. I don't really think that one's coming back. I think the question for the Republicans are going to be, do they get 51 seats or 55 seats, depending upon how the rest of those battleground districts would go. But again, remember in Georgia, for example, in 2022, they reelected a Republican governor and then reelected a Democratic senator. So that sort of ticket splitting exists to some degree in a number of the battleground states, which will be fascinating to watch. But with those House seats now, I don't think people have been paying attention to this, and I don't even really know. Is the Republican margin at this point 6 seats, 5 seats, somewhere around there? Yeah, so it's going to be pretty tight. And I think even if the Democrats manage to win a lot of those, I think it'll be smaller than the traditional Democratic majorities Nancy Pelosi had. So it'll be an interesting time for Jeffries if he becomes the new speaker and he's got a majority of 8 votes, which is exactly what it could be. So those are sort of a couple things to watch. So you did a good deep dive on Colorado, but now let's talk about the rest of the country and sort of jump around as you will. And since you're out west, I'll put you on the spot with Nevada and Arizona.
Yeah. So Nevada's an interesting one to watch. And one of the things I'll be looking for is some indicators of voter turnout in Las Vegas, in Clark County, where Las Vegas is situated. That is obviously like the main population center of the state. There's not a ton of population centers outside of that. But it's an area where it's one of the few really political machine and union run towns in this country. The Culinary Workers Union has been a very strong presence in Las Vegas and has really driven a lot of turnout for Democrats. So even when you see, Republicans with a narrow lead in polling, one of the things that has delivered some important victories for Democrats in recent years, particularly at the presidential level, is when the Culinary Workers Union shows up and tries to churn out a lot of votes for the Democratic candidate. It looks like they're going to be very active this year, and I'll just be curious to see what kind of effect that has. Do we actually see very large turnout like we did in 2020 from that area? Because that's something that really could deliver Nevada for the Democrats. And in Arizona, mainly I'm kind of interested, both the Latino turnout and also just kind of the suburban communities around Phoenix, around Tucson, and what kind of turnout we're seeing there, how their votes seem to be splitting. Arizona was an area where we were watching that really closely in 2020. Similarly, we were talking about swing states before. Arizona was not a swing state until very recently, but suddenly it's one that we're paying a lot of attention to. It used to be pretty reliably Republican, and suddenly, there's enough Democratic-leaning votes, enough Latino votes to make it competitive. So just be watching those suburban communities.
What's the flip side, too, on the Senate race, right? Because Carrie Lake's running, who ran for governor last time out and has been a huge election denier. She's badly trailing her Democratic Senate opponent, who's been in the House. But on the flip side, most polls, if you looked at them over the last 2 weeks, Trump's winning Arizona. So you've got all these strange sort of downdrafts and currents that are sort of moving around. So what do you make of this surge of independent registration? Do you think it's, Mike Murphy, my old friend who ran McCain's campaign, would say they're just Republicans or Democrats. They don't want to say it because they want to be cool. Or is there really an independent movement afoot under the ballot that we're not paying attention to?
I tend to agree with Mike Murphy on this, and there's a fair amount of political science evidence backing this up, that, the vast majority of independents really aren't, that, they are really loyal to one party or the other. They just don't call themselves that. And we see that just in general, that people don't like to describe themselves as partisan. People tend to call themselves independent. We've seen a lot of changes in state primary laws that actually make it easier for independents to vote in primaries. So people don't have to join a party if they want to, participate in a lot of elections. And, and that's fine. People are certainly welcome to do that, even if that makes it a little harder for us to poll them or predict their behavior. It may be that there is, there's enough just disgust in the political parties or kind of rejection of them, that we could be seeing some sort of longer term shift where people really are open to the idea of more independence, or a wider range of parties. But I think people tend to focus on that at the wrong level. They tend to try and organize at the presidential level and say, what we need is an independent candidate for president. We need a Bobby Kennedy Jr. or something like that. That really tends not to work. I would really encourage people to be doing more organizing at the local level, and trying to organize, new sets of parties in city council elections and county elections. But people tend not to do a lot of their organizing or attention at that level.
Well, I'm going to disagree with you that I think there is actually a movement. So there's a center at Arizona State, which actually is the only political science department which has a specific group of folks connected to studying independence. And they'd argue that if you look at 12, that block shifted strongly to Obama. They came around to Trump. Then they went to Biden. And so it'll be interesting to see where they end up this time. But I think we're going to see 2 years from now a set of folks run as independents for governor, because I think that's where you can pull off a race where an independent could be elected. And, there are independents in the Senate, obviously. the Angus King, who's from Maine, is a self-described independent. Bernie Sanders is an independent, but they caucus with the Democrats. I understand why Bernie does it. I'm not quite sure why Angus King does it, but anyway, he does. And Kirsten Sinema, did the same thing in Arizona, so they decided she wasn't going to run. But I do think there's a trend line out there we don't understand. And it, again, I think it'll be a good discussion in political science departments whether Trump essentially caused this bubble of independence and then they all fade away, or whether there's actually something going on, as we saw in the mid-1800s, where something happens to the Republican Party and it splits and there's a new party that forms. And again, I think if you look, people under the age of 30 don't register for either political party. And I think that's a statement. It may be that they don't like either of the party's politics. Maybe they'd want the Democrats further to the left. Maybe younger independents would prefer the Republicans, come more back to the middle, whatever the case might be. But I do think this is a phenomenon that's growing, and registration may be part of the explanation. But I think if you saw the huge swath of the American public that self-described themselves as double haters early on this summer, it was 20, 22, 24% of the American public. And I don't think this election is going to make all that go away. So we'll come back for one final segment. Our guest, if you don't read him on Substack, you should. He does wonderful columns, smart, incisive, and it's somebody that I always tend to look at. Seth Masket from the University of Denver. See you in a minute.
This podcast is brought to you by the American Property Owners Alliance. We are a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization that protects property owners and their interests. Did you know that in 10 states and Washington, D.C., the government can take more than what it is owed in property taxes in the instance of a foreclosure? From 2014 to 2021, 8,600 homes and more than $780 million in savings were lost to this practice, known as home equity theft. We are working to end home equity theft everywhere it remains on the books. Visit propertyownersalliance.org to join the effort to protect property rights.
Hey, welcome back. It's the final countdown episode from Lost in the Middle as we tiptoe towards election night. We originally set out to do 4 episodes, which we are doing in advance. I should tell you, we're going to have fun after the election and get together with 2 of my buddies who do political podcasts, Justin Young, who does Politics, and Andrew Heaton, who does the Political Orphanage, and sort of do our own analysis of what happened in the race. And we'll tape that, I think, 4 or 5 days after the election when sort of the dust is settled. So what else are you thinking about as we zero in, Seth? What's sort of captivating you as you stand in the shower or, drive down get stuck in the Denver traffic? So you've got lots of times to think.
Yeah, we were talking about split ticket voting. That's going to be pretty important in North Carolina, too, where you have, Republicans with a very unpopular gubernatorial candidate, but that state is still very close in its presidential race. You'll probably see a lot of people turning out, to vote on the presidential race. And I think there's a fair number of Republicans who either will vote for the Democrat or just simply won't vote on the gubernatorial line. But there'll be some split ticket voting there.
Now, a little bit of background for folks who haven't been following this story. So this was the lieutenant governor, was in a Republican primary in North Carolina. Trump weighed in for him and put his thumb on the scale, not fully appreciating the fact that this guy used to like to go to porn sites and post on it and say all kinds of crazy things. So, yeah, we've had a long line of weird Senate candidates. One of my best friends when I was in Congress was Mike Castle, who was a member of Congress from Delaware. Delaware has this weird thing where they just rotate chairs, right? So Castle used to be the governor, became a House of Representatives, and then ran for the Senate. And this was the heart of the Tea Party movement and must have been 2012, 2010. And he actually ended up running against a woman named Christine O'Donnell, who had a press conference after she won the primary to deny that she was a witch. Now, that may be one of the weirdest moments in American politics. And needless to say, the Republicans lost the Delaware seat, and Mike is doing great things now that he's left office. But, we managed to shoot ourselves in the head all the time with a lot of very strange candidates. So anyway, I broke up your thought. So there was one watching North Carolina. Although that's one of those heartbreakers for Democrats. I mean, they go to bed every election thinking they're going to win Texas. And it's not.
It never happens.
Yeah, for my Democratic friends, it's not going to happen. And I know they're putting money into the Florida Senate race. It's not going to happen. The Republicans every once in a while get all enthused. We're going to win some races in New Jersey, and it never happens. So just forget about it. I mean, it may be 2 years or 4 years from now we have to recalibrate. But I'm sorry I interrupted you. Other things other than North Carolina.
I mean, then there's just like what's going on in Pennsylvania. And I don't know how quickly Pennsylvania is going to be decided, but watching what's going on in Philadelphia, what turnout looks like there, how things tend to be trending in, there's a pretty substantial ring of suburban counties around Philadelphia that will tell us a lot about how the rest of the state is going to go. That's obviously really important. It's an important indicator to what's going to happen in Pennsylvania. And then in Pennsylvania, it's a pretty good bet that, whoever wins Pennsylvania wins the presidency. And also a decent bet that whoever wins the presidency, their party also wins the House. So a lot is going to be, hanging on that.
Yeah, in Pennsylvania, we've talked to folks from Pennsylvania, which we did in our last episode about the guy who founded Tangle, which is a great news site, who grew up in Pennsylvania, went to school in Pittsburgh. It sort of divides into thirds, right? So Philadelphia's got all the suburbs around it and a large city Democratic machine. Then you go to Pittsburgh, which is sort of conflicted, that will sort of vote more Republican or not. But then we go to our favorite place, which is on the far western corner of the state, which I'm reminded by the people we interviewed for our episode in Lost in the Middle. They're Cleveland Browns fans, and they hate both the Eagles and hate the Steelers. So Pennsylvania is a really interesting study as we get close. And Philadelphia's got the same problem Milwaukee has, right? So if we go to the conspiracy theories in 2020, in both cases you saw large fleets of semis showing up at 11 o'clock at night, dropping off ballots. And the reason is neither Wisconsin, for reasons I don't fully understand, and Pennsylvania have this rule that you can't count ballots until after the election polls close, which means you've always got these late night counts. They tend to happen in large cities. I mean, in Dane County, the voter turnout's 90%, but we'll have stuff go so fast that we'll be done by, 9 o'clock at night. And last time out, it was Milwaukee and Philadelphia that were the problem children. There was a move in Wisconsin to allow early vote counting. So you'd get the ballots in, you'd open them up, and you'd tabulate them. And then when the polls close, you take those tabulations to see how many people voted for which party in Madison. It's not really hard to figure out who's going to win it, and then add them to the day voters, and then you solve the issue. And in Wisconsin, they killed it, and in Pennsylvania, there really wasn't much of a movement. And I think if we want to get our house in order the same way we cleaned up the Florida election system after Bush-Gore, they should clean up the election systems in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin. Not clean up, just sort of push them, into the 22nd century rather than depending on all these counts. So, give me your best guesses, right? We'll hold you to these, I'm sure. President?
Oh, you know what? It's so freaking hard to call. It's really
I'm holding your children hostage with a gun to their head, okay?
Kamala Harris is getting, it has a 2.5 to 3 point national lead. That has been really stable over the last month or two. And that's right around where Democrats need to get in order to win the Electoral College, which just means the polling isn't going to tell us anything more. You want to, okay, gun to my family's head, sure. I think she pulls it out, but so much of this is we have a lot of pollsters really trying to make up for mistakes from 2016 and 2020. Not mistakes, but like, some biases in the polls that tended to understate Trump support. So they're trying to come up with new methods to do this. We think they've probably got it right, but the polls are still fairly likely to be off by 1 or 2 percentage points. We don't know in which direction.
So I'm going to add an air of uncertainty here. In the spring elections, where all the trouble began in the UK, when they were wrong on Brexit, wrong on Scottish independence, they were wrong last spring when they tried to do this juggling again. Not that the Labour Party didn't win, but that the Reform Party and the Reform, help me out here, the other group, the Labour Democrats, or whatever you call them, ended up getting substantial seats. So keep an eye on polling. That'll be the interesting the match, because I don't think anybody's got this figured out, because conservative voters just won't answer pollsters because they think the pollsters are extension of the media, which they don't like. So Seth Masket, thanks for your perception. I appreciate it. I'll be looking for your writings on Substack, and when you're searching for Seth's, be sure to pick up mine on Lost in the Middle. So there you go, voters. Let's see how things turn out, and we'll come back to you with Justin and Heaton after the election to give you our views one more time. Thanks, everybody. If you like this episode of Lost in the Middle, please remember to subscribe to our podcast. And if you enjoyed it, please tell your friends and pals.